Stephen Hurahan here at BrandMasterAcademy.com, and in this video I want to talk to you about brand promise. Now, there is a lot of misinformation out there about what brand promise is, what brand promise is not, but specifically in this video I want to break down what the brand promise is in relation to and how you can go about communicating your brand promise to your audience. Now, brand promise is not the most complex topic in the wider spectrum of branding. It's one of the easier ones when you step back and look at it logically. The brand promise is the promise that the brand makes to its audience as to what they can expect from the brand. So you would think that brand builders and entrepreneurs, they'd all be on the same page, but they're not. And I've experienced this firsthand through the experiences that I've had with entrepreneurs, business owners, and even other brand builders. The main cause for confusion here are twofold. First of all, it's how the promise is delivered, and secondly, it's what that promise is in relation to. So that's what we're going to dive into in this video. So why don't we start with the definition of a brand promise. So the brand promise is the promise that a brand makes to its audience, either literal or assumed, about the overall experience that they can expect from the brand. Now, before we go on, there's a couple of points worth dissecting from this definition. So the first is in relation to the promise that is literal or assumed. So what's that all about? Well, essentially the promise can be defined by the brand by articulating what their commitment is, by articulating what they promise to their audience, or the promise can be assumed. If the brand hasn't gone about articulating the promise, well, then the audience will assume that a promise is being made by the experiences that they've had with the brand, whether direct or indirect. They'll build an idea of what the brand is promising. Now, the other point in reference to that definition is the experience. So the promise being made to the audience, whether it's direct or indirect, is in relation to the overall experience of the brand. Yes, it can include the differentiation strategy, the point of difference, the value being offered, but it's the whole experience that the audience can expect. So essentially what this means is that every brand makes a promise, whether they go out and articulate that promise or not. If you're building a brand and you haven't gone out and articulated your promise, well, then your audience is going to start to build their idea of what you're promising. Now, the reality is that most businesses, most brands, they do not go out and articulate a brand promise. Now, some do, of course. Some have a brand promise statement. Some have a promise directly within their tagline. But 90% of brands never actually articulate a promise. Now, because of that, there is a lot of confusion around the tagline. Because some brands go out and put a promise directly in their tagline, then most people, a lot of people certainly, assume that the tagline is actually the brand promise, and that's not the case. Just because some brands have a promise within their tagline, it doesn't mean that all taglines are brand promises. And I've seen this time and again with articles online giving the best examples of brand promises and just showing a list of taglines, assuming that a brand promise is a tagline because they've seen some promises within taglines. That's not the case. The tagline and the brand promise are two completely separate branding elements, and they have different jobs to do. They have different tasks at hand, and they're used differently from a strategic branding point of view. The job of the tagline is to help establish the brand in the mind of their audience for the position that that brand wants to own in that mind, and that position is defined within the positioning strategy. If the audience is able to remember the tagline, and that's the job of the tagline, to plant itself in the mind of the audience so that they are able to remember and recall that tagline and associate that tagline with an idea or a value determined within the positioning strategy. On the other hand, the brand promise has a different task. The brand promise is there to set in place the expectation of the overall brand experience, and that's in relation to everything, not just the position and not just the value offered within the position. It's the experience across the board, everything from the communication strategy to the personality to the visual appeal that that brand sets out. Every single touch point of a brand is part of the overall experience of that brand. So that's what the audience can expect. That's what the brand promise is in relation to. So the tagline and the brand promise are completely separate and they have different tasks. Now, there are a few different ways that you can go about communicating your brand promise, but whether you take the time to articulate that promise or not, you're only going to have so much control as to how your audience builds the expectations in their mind, because the experience of a brand can either be direct or indirect. So we can experience a brand through their direct touch points, whether it's their website, an email we receive, an advertisement that we see, or it can be an indirect experience as well. So we can talk to our friends and they can say, oh, I've picked up this new brand, I love this and this about it. And that will then begin to shape the idea of that brand in our mind, even though we've not had any sort of direct contact with that brand. So this just goes to show that, of course, we can control how our audience and how the wider market sees our brand, but at the end of the day, it is the audience that will determine what our brand looks like, what it feels like to them in their mind. And this kind of backs up what Marty Neumeier says, that your brand is not what you say it is, it's what they say it is. Now, there are three types of brand promises, so let's look at the options that you have when it comes to communicating what that promise is. And the first one is your tagline. You can pop a promise right there within your tagline, and the benefit of this is that it doubles down on a commitment and a position that you want to be known for in the market. If you're really confident about delivering on that promise, then you can articulate that within your tagline. But as always, your tagline needs to be concise, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be memorable as well. So don't sacrifice any of those characteristics for getting a promise in there. But if you really do want to double down on owning a position in the mind of your audience in relation to the value that you offer from a promise given, then that is a very good option to look at. The other way that you can articulate a brand promise is through a brand promise statement. So you can take the time to look at your overall brand and the overall experience that you want your audience to understand about your brand, what you want your audience to expect from your brand, and you can define that in a brand position statement. And that will act as a very good internal document as well for everybody within the brand. And you can also go out and communicate that as well directly on your website or through your social channels, etc. And the third way, of course, is your indirect promise. So essentially, you're not articulating a promise as such, but what you are doing is you're setting expectations throughout all of your touch points, all of your communication strategy. Wherever your audience will see your brand and experience your brand, then you have some kind of communication in there shaping what they can expect from the brand. So they are the three ways there: your tagline, your brand positioning statement, and of course your indirect promise. Now, in my experience, when it comes to this point with clients, and I explain this to them, that their audience will actually shape their own expectations of their brand, they ask me, well, what's the point in articulating the promise? And it is a good question, but there are some benefits in articulating the promise. Yes, of course, your audience are going to build their own expectations beyond what you just set in place as a promise. But if you do put in place and articulate a promise, well, then that's going to narrow their focus. And when they think of your brand and think of what to expect from your brand, they're going to recall that. So it will shape and narrow their overall expectations. And as I said, a couple of very good ways to do that is through the tagline and focusing their recollection of your brand in on that difference that you offer and the value of that difference. And the other way is through the brand positioning statement, by setting in place a statement and communicating that statement online or through your social presence, or using that statement as a guide for all of your external communication. What it does is it helps to shape the expectations in the mind of your audience. So yes, they will determine their own expectations and they will create their own ideas of what your brand is, but the more refined your communication, the more focused and strategic your communication as to what their expectation should be, the better they'll be able to shape your brand in the light that you want your brand to be seen. Now, I've had a few people ask me about how they can go about developing their own brand promise statement. So I'm going to do a follow-up video to this, and I'll link to it somewhere up here or in the description below. But I'd really love to hear from you about your experience around brand promise. Whether you're building your brand for yourself or you're building a brand for a client, how are you going about articulating your promise, or are you articulating your promise at all? How are you going about shaping shaping your audience's perceptions around their expectation of the experience that they can expect from your brand. So I'd love to hear your perspective on it, your thoughts, your challenges. Have you got any challenges around your brand promise or writing a brand promise statement? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, if it gave you a fresh perspective, if it helped you in any way, please give it a thumbs up. Please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. It'll let you know when I release new videos, and I will see you in the next one.